So we had all the unity.
All right. Welcome. Coming. Thanks to students changing your schedule, coming to the class. Thanks for others in the community joining. John, thank you for being here. Steve, I'll introduce some other folks. So I'm Wes Eaton. I'm new faculty here in the Haub School. Got here last fall and I started a research project and met some of these folks who are invited here to share today. This topic is on specifically on Via Ferrata, but the bigger picture is what we're focused on is outdoor recreation and changing economies in Wyoming. But this has certainly been a topic and conversation that's catalyzed discussion. So the vision for this panel and for these activities is part of that bigger conversation. Kurt Davidson and I, who I'll introduce in a minute, wanted to connect students with stakeholders around this issue and connect a range of different stakeholders with different experiences and different knowledges they bring back to the Haub School. So encapsulated in a nutshell, that's the bigger purpose or vision of this. There's lots of other engagements and conversations going on with outdoor recreation and state parks and Via Ferrata and things like that that we're part of, but more narrowly, that's where we're situating the conversation here. So let me briefly introduce the panelists. John Pingree, thanks for joining us from Eastern Shoshone and Wind River Reservation. And we have Kyle Burness from the state parks, the Shoshone region. And we have Harry Kent, he's from Estes Park. He's a Via Ferrata designer and installer. He is not directly related to the project we're going to be talking about today, but he works nationally and internationally on Via Ferrata and outdoor recreation. We've got Ron Smith from Lander, longtime Lander resident, nice history with University of Wyoming, and works with an organization in the Lander community called Sinks Canyon Wild. And we have Christina Gonzalez, community member of Lander. She's in health and nursing and activism around women's rights. And all of us have some point to share about the experiences we've had. So I also want to introduce Steve Smutko, Ruckelaus Institute and Haub School, who's going to be moderating. And then my new friend and colleague, Kurt Davidson, he's in the Haub School here, is going to make a broader introduction about what's going on and set the stage for what the conversations are going to be about. So thank you all.
All right, thanks, Wes. So this Via Ferrata issue is tearing our community apart. That's what we heard time and time again as we started to think about and talk to people from the Lander community and Wyoming in general. And that really struck me. How can recreation development tear a community apart? You know, we think oftentimes of building a new rec facility and rejoicing in a new place to go inside and play. We think about bike trails around town. Hey, we're making the community safer. So this is tearing our community apart. That really struck a chord with me. I just really had to stop and think about what is going on here. There's got to be stuff under the surface going on. And that's really kind of how this all originated. And so I wanted to bring that to your attention as we start to think about recreation development in Lander Via Ferrata. But really, it's the question of a larger issue of recreation development around the state, around the American West, around the world, really. I know most of you in this room have been to a trailhead out there on a parking spot, or you hike into your favorite lake out in the backcountry, and there's a tent right where you were going to put yours. So these are issues that we're going to have to grapple with. And so hopefully we can have panels and dialogue and avoid having to say statements like, this is tearing our community apart. So that's kind of what we're here a little bit to talk about today. I want to provide a little bit of overview what Via Ferrata is. Anybody find one in here? A couple people, all right, nice. Okay, So, put very simply, it's a series of iron rungs, ladders, cables, bridges installed into rock or the natural environment in such a way to help facilitate the movement over that rock, usually vertically. You're climbing up something. It was first, a little bit of the history, there's a storied history to it. They were first thought to be installed in the Alps to help facilitate troop movements in World War I. Get the troops from one side of the mountain to the other. So that's kind of how this activity got born, and then it was just kind of left there. Climber found this and decided, hey, let's try to climb this. Maybe it was raining that day. I'm not good for rock climbing, but I don't want to be a Ferrata. So the blossoming recreation activity here in the United States. We think, so there's not a great definition of what via Ferrata is, but most people think there's about 20 to 30 going on right now in the United States. And I'll let Harry speak more about this later, but they're being installed in more creative places. So we just saw the installation of the first urban via Ferrata in the United States in Cleveland, Ohio. So they're starting to pop up in new and interesting places. It's a repurposed quarry that they're using for now via Ferrata area. So the question and concerns in the US, some would argue, you could say, well, what at face value, what are the issues with via Ferrata? So you're talking about installation of these types of things into the rock. That means permanently drilling holes in the rock. That can be an issue that often comes up. Talking about disturbing wildlife that may nest, oftentimes birds will nest in rock areas like this. Increased visitation and safety. It has what we term in the industry perceived risk. So you're high off the ground, you feel like you might fall, even though it's actually statistically speaking a very safe activity. But like all things, those are some of the cons. There's also some pros, and that's what's been interesting about this project is when you think about the positives, they're often in the abstract. So might this bring economic development and opportunity to the Lander community? Maybe. Might it provide another safe, exciting recreation opportunity to get people to stop in Lander on their way from Denver to Jackson? Could be. We just don't know. So it's hard to have the conversation when you can very realistically see a hole drilled into a rock, but it's hard to anticipate the economic or social or recreational impact opportunities that something like this might bring in. So that's what we're talking about. We talk about via Ferrata. It's really a manifestation of values. So if you value preservation and conservation, you might find yourself on one side of the argument. If you value economic opportunity, recreation opportunity, adventure, excitement, thrill seeking, you might find yourself on the other side of the opportunity. And we consistently found that those values manifest in different ways when thinking and talking about the via Ferrata in Lander. And we think this is a perfect microcosm for the values that state of Wyoming and other stakeholders, people that value natural space and recreation, will have to grapple with in the coming future. What is our values? Do we value preservation above all? Do we value interaction with the natural environment and all the opportunities that brings? We'll have to decide. So we wanted today to be about fostering collaboration, not necessarily rehashing the via Ferrata issue in Lander, although that's certainly likely to come up. We want this to be a conversation about the future. How do we come together in a room with differing values and still have meaningful dialogue, find consensus and collaboration with each other? That's really what start hopefully this panel and then continuing throughout this semester and year here at the Haub School and Ruckelshaus Institute. We want to foster productive information exchange with accurate information and that takes into other people's viewpoints. Particularly, that's true in a somewhat post-truth era where anybody can post on social media any opinion or fake news article and get it out there quickly. Well, how do people in charge of accurate information control that dialogue that's happening around the recreation space to make sure we are talking about the same thing? And we are anticipating that the recreation opportunity is accurate, that information that we put out there. But really, and this is the point I'll leave you with before I turn it over to Dr. Smuckhead, is that we're co-creating this world we want to see. Sinks Canyon State Park is very adjacent to Lander, but it's a state park. That means if you're paying taxes in Wyoming, it's also your state. So you should have a voice as well. You're paying for those tax dollars. Same with the national parks. You're paying federal taxes. Those are your parks. So at some point, we have to figure out how we come together, co-create this world where we're all happy with the future that we're working towards. That's what the panel is about. So thanks for being here. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Steve Smutko, and leave it to him.
All right, thanks, Kurt. All right, so we have 4 questions that we are going to ask the panelists to weigh in on, and they're really focused around, we're going to start with the first question, and what I'll do is we'll start with Christina, and wait for that tone to go down. I think we're good. And maybe if I stand somewhere else, would that work? I will stand somewhere else. We'll try this. So Christina, so what does the Via Ferrata mean to you?
That was the first question I thought we were doing today.
That is the first question.
The Via Ferrata to me means another boom in our community for recreation and tourism. I think since 2017, and I mentioned this in our meet and greet today, since 2017, Lander has seen a really big increase in tourism. We were one of the main sites for the total solar eclipse, and that brought in a lot of people that otherwise never would have thought about coming to Lander. I've seen the human impact with the increased tourism. In the canyon, it's really obvious. There's litter on our trails. There's increased traffic and congestion throughout the loop road, the canyon floor, parking lots. It's really hard to find a safe parking spot, especially in the area where this activity is proposed. I hike there pretty regularly with my family of 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. And if you ever try to manage children at that age in a parking lot that's maybe 20 feet deep, you know, it's constant monitoring for fast traffic coming right into the canyon. So it's a quite hazardous spot in general, let alone increasing the traffic condition there. There's also obvious trail degradation throughout our canyon, and I feel that the Via Ferrata means to me is that it's putting a permanent structure and changing the landscape of a finite resource that we have to enjoy.
All right, thanks, Christina. We'll just move on down the line. So Ron, what does the Via Ferrata issue mean to you?
Well, first of all, I am president of the Sinks Canyon Wild. And what it means to Sinks Canyon Wild, I think the best way for me to explain that is to share a little bit of history with you. And a newspaper article written by citizens related to the 1880s recognized that Sinks Canyon's unique natural resources were in danger of being damaged and advocated for examining ways of safeguarding those resources, being overwhelmed by development. Additionally, citizens realized the importance of Sinks Canyon to the area's wildlife. When the board, Wyoming Game and Fish Department, purchased land in Sinks Canyon for the purpose of habitat protection. And today, most of Sinks Canyon State Park is designated as an official wildlife habitat management. The public's concern for Sinks Canyon ultimately resulted in the creation of Sinks Canyon State Park in 1971. And the purpose of the park is to protect Sinks Canyon's unique natural cultural resources, which the public realized, and I quote, would be overwhelmed and developed, destroying what attracted many to Sinks Canyon in the first place. With the development of park facilities must accent and enhance these values. To overwhelm them with chrome-plated campgrounds and concession stands would be unwise, end of quote. That quote is from an official state park sign located at the rise of the Sink. Same desire to protect Sinks Canyon's resources expressed from as early as the 1880s continues today. The most numerous comment that's made by citizens during the recent public comment period that resulted in an award-winning new state park master plan was, I quote, "Deep Sink Canyon Wild." We at Sinks Canyon Wild are proud to continue that, represent that legacy that started way back when.
Thanks, Ron. So Harry, you know, this is not your community, but I'm sure that Via Ferratas have a lot of meaning to you. So help us understand what that is.
Yeah, thanks. I started climbing over 50 years ago. I'm a climber at heart. And I've seen a lot of evolution in the climbing community. Even going back to the days when I was not, I did not actually clip notes when I was on climbing routes. I was such an person that was like, no, I'm not going to take direct aid. I'm not going to use extra means to get up some of these climbs. But I wasn't necessarily a purist, but I thought, no, I'm just going to climb with my hands and feet. Right around that time, I started and founded Kent Mountain Adventure Center, rock climbing and guide school. We've had that now for over 32 years. And in the process of seeing that evolution of taking people climbing, mountaineering into the mountains and in sport climbing crags, I saw this sort of need, like one of the words I was going to use was access. Via Ferrata to me means access. I see a need or opportunity to expand what we might think is traditional climbing to more people, not because we want more people out there climbing, but there's people out there, if they're able to do a Via Ferrata, who put themselves into a really awesome position that normally would be reserved for technical rock climbers. Via Ferrata to me also means it's an art form to actually build and design one of these things. I don't just go out there with our guys and crew and go, all right, let's drill there. We're just going to go and drill and go. No, it takes us many hours to look where that route goes. It's an art form. It also means access. In fact, Via Ferrata is Italian. I get that question asked all the time. What does Via Ferrata mean? Well, it means iron road, iron path. And that's what a Via Ferrata is. It's a path. It's actually a trail. In fact, a lot of the Forest Service people we talk to, you can fill out some of these applications to install a Via Ferrata, and to them, it's just a trail. It's a protected climbing route. Whether or not it has rungs, whether or not it has a lot of cable or just a 50-foot section of cable, it's a protected path. So it's kind of interesting because in some ways, Via Ferrata to me means a protected road, a protected way to get up and through the mountains.
Thanks, Harry. So Kyle, you know, given your role as a parks professional and being involved in this because Sinks Canyon State Park is within your district. So what does it mean to you?
Yeah, I think Kurt hit on a lot of things that struck a chord earlier, because there's been a lot of times during the last couple of years where I've thought myself that, hey, we're talking about something that's not just a Via Ferrata question. That there's maybe this is a microcosm for some other themes, some other ideas that I've heard come up, not just in Landry, but in other places that people another spot too. And so, you know, how does this process reflect how we're going to do this in the future? What does it mean for not just this particular potential project, but future projects at other parks and other public lands? And how do people respond to that? and how do we develop that process moving forward in a productive way.
All right. And then John. So as your role as a tribal cultural and spiritual representative, also as a tribal historic preservation officer, put this in perspective from put us in your shoes on this one. What does it mean to you?
This project opened the doors for the Shoshone tribe because it was never involved in the state project of the park services.
Uh-huh.
But it affects everything. It affects both the property resources in the area, the development. And we have a rich history dating back 9,000 years in this area. And we shared it with the Crow people, this area is named the Crow tribe, describing the water. They call it the Crow shut in the Crow language, the dirt and the water. So we have a very rich history. It's one of our migration routes that we travel through in this area, and we're migrating. We started to berries, plants, it provided everything for survival.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question. We've got plenty of time now. We had reserved 15 minutes for that question. You guys did it more quickly. So this next question, we're going to sort of, thinking about what the Via Ferrata means and the issue as it relates to you and your own perspectives. But moving forward, and we know, as Kurt had, brought it out, that there's this symbol, the Via Ferrata, fomented a lot of conflict within the Lander community. And so, in the purpose of this panel really is to think about, okay, this is probably something that we're going to be seeing in Wyoming coming up from now on. I think, as we develop an outdoor recreation economy. And I think there's great lessons to be learned here. And you guys have experienced this. It still touches nerves. I know that. But to be thinking in the future. So the question is what does it look like to work together successfully on issues like this and put them past us? So, and I'm gonna randomly select you. Okay, so Ron, if you're ready, what does it look like? How do we think about this moving forward? What have we learned?
Well, first of all, Sinks Canyon Wild has always been open to candid dialogue with all the stakeholders involved in this issue. And we've had a strong desire to look for commonality rather than divisiveness. We believe, this is what we believe. We believe that a well-planned and properly located Via Ferrata could be of a significant benefit for Land River. That just simply does not fit with the reasons and values for which the state park was created. There are, however, a plethora of cliffs in the area where a world-class Via Ferrata could be located. Most of those cliffs are found on federally managed lands, and as such would require rigorous social, cultural, safety, and environmental review, as well as an in-depth public comment. And we believe such a rigorous review and public comment period is necessary and desired by the public. Sinks Canyon Wild would be very supportive of that. Those of us who live in Lander live there because of what we have. Sinks Canyon is very special to us. I'm betting every one of us in this room has suffered the pain of seeing projects that have permanently damaged the places we love. These projects infuriate, sadden. Beneficial projects, on the other hand, happen when they have the support and commitment of local people. And they happen when they make sense to the public. We don't believe this proposed Via Ferrata makes sense in the state park.
All right.
That's how we can move forward.
Okay. All right. So what you're saying is located outside of the city. find another place for
The one public hearing we had on this a couple of years ago, I opened that public hearing saying the Via Ferrata is not the problem. The location of the Via Ferrata is the problem, and I still think that's the case.
it. Okay, thanks, Ron. I'm going to move on to Christina. So from your perspective then, thinking about moving forward, particularly within the Lander community, and you know, you've lived there for many years, you understand sort of the dynamics of your community. So, you know, what is a successful movement forward for you?
Well, I was actually thinking of touching on what you had said about a recreational economy.
Uh-huh.
That kind of plays into the cultural capitalist society that we are entering into. So recreation economy and capitalism, and there's a destructive nature that comes with capitalism. And so for me, I kind of feel that it would be a really righteous idea for once we put the capitalist nature aside and listen to the human emotions that we have about this and preserve what is a dwindling resource. I mean, we're seeing the effects of climate change in Lander. Last year, it was dry as a bone. You could go mountain biking, you know, with your regular tires. This year, you're 27 inches deep over at JDR. So we see and we feel the environmental changes. And if we are to bring in a recreational economy into that limited resource area, it's just going to deteriorate it. And I respect what Ron's saying about moving it somewhere else. And I hate to be part of the NIMBY culture of not in my backyard. But at the same time, that it's a finite resource, it's a precious resource. It's one that stirs up a lot of emotions, and it would be very righteous if our small community chose the emotions and preservation of that place over capitalism.
Okay. That's a perspective I wasn't expecting. That's good, thank you. John, so from your perspective, what's the path forward for you?
Listening to people in the community, their concerns of the area, those for it or against it. And once you disturb it, cannot change that.
Okay. So just listening to people.
Right.
Okay. And from your perspective, then, what would that look like? What would we do to make that happen?
I would say leave it up to people who
Uh-huh.
have a vote on.
Okay.
See who will do it.
All right. Kyle, what are you thinking about in terms of a movement forward?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with relationship building. And so, and not just at a certain point in time, you know, the relationship building has to happen before, during, and after a process like this happens. Because the people in any community want to have a say in anything that's going to happen in that area. And I think it almost has to be, from our standpoint, like a public immersion, right? Where we're immersed in these communities in a meaningful way, in a way that's organic, in a way that makes sense, where we have the right relationships with the right people, so that they tell us how to feel. You know, you don't hear it from some other source, but you can hear it from the person that you're talking to. And I think we've started to build those relationships, and we're continuing to do that. I know Ron pretty well. I've been to his house. I have a lot of respect for Ron. And just continuing that type of process, and not just here in Lander and at Sinks Canyon, but beyond. I mean, I think that's going to be part of what we need to do to move forward.
Maybe put that in a little bit of context about what's been going on so far. So how has Parks engaged people? What's happened, you know, coming up into this, up to today? We have a little time to explore this topic.
So I guess we can go back a little bit and talk about the master plan process. And so that came up before I started working there, but the state park hired a company to develop a master plan for them. They had one that was created back in the seventies that was obviously outdated, right? I mean, a lot of things have changed in the last 50 years that the park needs to take another look at it. And so the company came in, they had a process that's pretty typical of a master plan where they involved the public, they had a steering committee and several public meetings. And one of the projects that came up as a possibility was this project. And since then, we've had a few other public meetings. We had a big public meeting in Anchor that had probably about 300 folks there. There was some discussion about the project at that time, as well as time for people in the public to come in and say what they wanted to say about the project. Since that meeting, which I think was maybe 2 years ago, there have been subsequent meetings that I think would considered small stakeholder meetings. The original proposed location of the Via Ferrata was within potential conflict to a peregrine nest that was within. It's been a while, but 50 yards or so from that proposed route. And so there were some discussions after that where, and some concerns raised by the public, where that proposed route was changed to what it is now. There's a new location that's been proposed that's on State Park's own property. We've since the last time we've had a small stakeholder meeting, have started the process to investigate more about that property and would it be suitable for something like this. So we've had the TIPO offices, the Tribal Historic Preservation offices for Eastern Shoshone and the Northern Arapaho come in and do surveys. We've had the State Historic Preservation Office come in and do cultural surveys. We're still, going through the list to gather information to say, hey, that you meet all the criteria that it would. And once we have all that information, we're going out to the public, and having another public meeting to discuss that.
Okay, so providing avenues in a structured way to get
That's the
feedback.
goal, yes. And in the meantime, though, we've had, internal discussions where I've, for example, myself, I've met with Sinks Canyon Wild on several occasions. The superintendent there at Sinks Canyon has. We've met with other community organizations and community leaders to try and just mostly listen to how they feel about the project and kind of where we are now with it, but where we plan to go next with that process.
Okay. So listening might be a key word for it.
Yes.
Okay. And then Harry, so from your perspective, not in this community, but probably seeing, experiencing, you install these Via Ferrata in other communities, is that correct? So, and sort of maybe what you've heard about or how you've seen this, sort of what's been your experience with these in other communities, and how have they grappled if they had to with some of these issues?
Most of our work has been on private land, and not so much in a community setting. The project that we installed in Columbus, Ohio, it was a court, an abandoned court that was last 50 years ago. And they reclaimed it, and they said, "Hey, what can we do with this ugly sore that we have right here in this community?" And so one of the park rangers came up with the idea, "Hey, there's a little bit of climbing across town. Why can't we put in a Via Ferrata?" And so we were able to do that, and it worked out great. It's a state park. They have kayaking, they have hiking, biking trails, and it's been great. Great use of an eyesore. Actually. I can speak more to perhaps the Via Ferrata maybe as an industry moving forward. But that was part of the question, and it's a new industry. Let's face it. There's over 20 Via Ferratas or so in this country, and there's only a few design build companies in this country. And we're still trying to figure out, we're trying to navigate through some of the funding systems, what we need to do in order to feel good about moving forward. I think moving forward, what I would do is successfully listening. I've certainly been with everyone here and all over here today. And moving forward in terms of some regulations, frankly.
Yeah.
Right now, anybody can go to Hilton and buy a grill and start grilling with hide or, or private property, but there are standards in Europe that are met for building the apparatus in Europe. And, those companies, there's 2 or 3 of them in this country that have adopted those European standards as part of bringing the Ferrata into the fold of a sort of a better business model in this country. We've also seen U.S. standards much cheaper. They've been building them for 100 years. So moving forward, I think we as an industry, the Ferrata builders, need to work with the Forest Service, BLM, not so much the park there, they're kind of figured out that wilderness as it should. But on, okay, how are we going to approve a builder? What are they going to have to do in order to conduct a build of the Ferrata? What regulations should we hold them to? And I think we're in a position where we can sort of dictate some of those regulations, at least those of us who feel that are doing a good job building these. So we need their help to sort of do our thing, and work together. And so we're listening to them, they're listening to us, because the fact is, there is room for more new Ferratas in the United States, which is this. And there will be more that go up. And I think it is really important. I mean, this product is a good point. It's a finite resource. Our planet, bigger picture, and there is only so much room for a sport climbing area, for a Jeep trail. And I do see comparisons sort of 50 years ago when the four-wheel drive people were trying to figure out, okay, well, give us a road, give us a place to go if you want to do our thing. In some ways, there's a lot of similarities here. Give us a place to have a Via Ferrata. We'll do it right. We'll get into the community, we'll listen, and great. And we have our little compartment right next to maybe a sport climbing area, right next to the hiking trail. So dialogue's going to be really important moving forward in order to offer this type of recreation, which is an awesome way to recreate. Via Ferrata is something like almost like a journey. Unlike rock climbing, unlike sport climbing, there you are, your partner, they go up, they come down, you might have your family in a group, but it's sort of this static experience where you're stationed. Climbing the Via Ferrata, if it's a longer one, is a journey with your family. It can be with your wife, with your children, where you're all sort of moving along this cable and clipping through the runs and onto the cable and clipping the landings, but it's not this static thing when you're at the base. Now, there can be climbs, multi-pitch climbs, you can be moving along, but not with your family. Perhaps maybe that one.
Yeah. I like the picture you painted. All right, so let's move on. And now this question really is focused around, from having this thing happening over the last couple of years. What have you learned? And I'll start with you, John, sort of from your perspective, so and seeing what's going on in the community and also, with people within your tribe. What's being learned here, and what have you learned?
Learned a lot. Meeting people, listening to their concerns. And having an open ear and looking at this area and thinking back to what my people looked at before the Europeans came. And seeing it now from a different perspective. Brought a lot of issues within the community like we were saying. The big thing, I'm sure a lot of hurt feelings, a motions. To her. Oh, it's really disruption. Woke people up.
Yeah. All right. Christina, I'm gonna ask you, what have you learned?
I've learned that transplants like myself, people that came in from the community, most likely an urban setting, metropolis area, came into Lander, Wyoming. Transplants and native non-transplant individuals alike are finding a common ground, a passionate common ground about protecting and preserving the authenticity and beauty of Sinks Canyon. And I think that that's really special because 15 years ago when I moved to Lander, it was, oh, you work for Noel, I'll see you later in 5 years. And now, 15 years later, I'm still there and feeling very passionate about this community and the changes that I'm seeing. And I now have a common ground with some people that may have been part of the, oh, you're a transplant. And we're fighting on the same team to preserve this area. And so I think that's kind of nice. That's bringing people together in a good way. And it's getting conversations started that we otherwise may not have had. I feel very fortunate that in my job recently, I was able to have a conversation with an older gentleman whose family moved here back in the early 1900s. And he was able to provide perspective of what Sinks Canyon looked like in the 1930 timeframe, where it was a dirt road and there was still lots of wildness about it that just I will never appreciate and understand. And I would like to be able to preserve something for my children if they choose to stay in this area that they can be proud of and hold true to them. So I'm really thankful that we've been given this opportunity to work together, to communicate, to hold each other accountable for our decisions and to find a common ground and work together towards something.
And do you think that because of this issue that the community has more capacity to deal with future issues coming up like this?
I think it gives us capacity to find a common ground instead of being like, oh, you were born and raised here. It's, oh, we share this commonality. We have something that we can talk about and find a solution together. And you can bring your perspective of where you grew up in the areas and the cultural perspective that you bring, and I can bring my same attributes in, and we can create a solution together. And I feel like that's probably one of the hardest things I've seen, coming into my 20s and 30s on my own out here is how do I articulate that there's a problem, but more importantly, how do I create that solution? How do I create a solution that's going to benefit a lot of people and not create more problems?
Yeah. Ron, what have you learned?
Well, all stakeholders obviously have to collaborate and cooperate with each other in order for all of us to attain our desired goals. And I don't think there's any room for language of animosity or intolerance to displace wise stewardship. We all can't hate each other if we're on different sides of an issue. And when communications and collaboration break down, stakeholders retreat to their respective camps and almost by necessity, we all start thinking the worst, right? And another thing is that we all know that it's really easy to put an economic value on a home, a vehicle, or even a Via Ferrata. But it's a lot more difficult to put true value on the work of a peregrine falcon or a mule deer or a migration corridor. In a world that truly values fiscal wealth, it's equally important to also value those things that cannot be easily defined, but are intuitively understood, irreplaceable, and priceless. Fortunately, our economic system hasn't yet been capable of or willing to capture the true value of such things. They are, however, very important, as we've seen in this issue, and need strong consideration to obtain public support and approval. Those are some of the things that I think we've all lost.
All right, good. Harry, what are you thinking about on this case?
I think history matters. We cannot overlook the importance of a place, a spiritual place, or a place where people recreate. What and how that area has been historically going back 9,000 years or more. And we have got to respect the history of these areas and be very willing to say, you know what, historically, a Via Ferrata doesn't belong here. Here's 5 reasons why it doesn't. Maybe it's similar to horses, you know, in the early days, I'm saying 150 years ago, we were trying to figure out, okay, what is going to be designated a horse trail and what's going to be designated a hunting trail. And we preserved a lot of those horse trails, many of them in Wyoming, for that reason, because historically, those horses and the people who rode them and have a connection with that way of life, they deserve that, and they're entitled, they literally should be and are entitled to that. Feel the same way about rock climbing areas. Historically, some areas were just traditional climbing, no artificial line, none. There were no bolts, there were no pitons, no steel. Those areas historically, out of respect to the pioneers who put those roots up and the people who use them, should remain that way. It would be horrible to retro-bolt some of those climbs. Via Ferrata, I believe, is a place for Via Ferrata. Is it right breathing down a sport climbing area? Absolutely not. Is it 5 miles away from a sport climbing area? Could it coexist? For sure. However, the respect we need to give to the historical past use of these areas not be able.
All right. Thanks. So Kyle, you'll wrap up on this question, but I want to preface it a little bit. You know, I've known you for a couple of years. You've been enrolled in our professional development program. I've watched you sort of as this unfolded and sort of mentored you through some of the rough spots. So sum up your learning on this issue.
I've learned that people do want to be involved in this type of conversation, which was something that I didn't necessarily know before, right? So I'm originally from Louisiana, as you couldn't tell, and I worked in state parks there for a long time. I worked in Oklahoma State Parks for a few years, and this type of conversation didn't come up, right? There just wasn't. The state parks wanted to go build something in Oklahoma, and we're building it, right? There's no discussion, none. So it was not really surprising, but it was interesting to kind of fall into a situation like this, where people were already having this conversation, wanting to be a part of it in a bigger way, because it just wasn't something I had seen before. And there's not necessarily a handbook that anybody gave me that said, hey, here's how you navigate that. So a lot of it became intuitive for me. I mean, I have spent, even though I haven't been in this particular type of situation before, I have spent 20 years in state parks and working with the public. And sometimes people weren't happy about stuff, and you had to sit down and go, okay, well, what do we do? What do you want to have happen? And really learn how to listen to people, learn how to get yelled at without taking it personally, get mud slung at me, and all of these things, but knowing that the real purpose is bigger, right? That people just want to be heard, even when they're spitting at you, cussing at you. They just want you to hear something. And so I was able to at least use some of those skills and transfer them to this purpose. And I think moving forward, it would be nice, and this is something I'd like to get out of it, working with the Haub school and maybe with some of the students, is what is that handbook? What does that handbook look like, so that I can give it to the next guy that comes in, or next guy that comes in and say, here's how you do it. And let's figure out how to do it right together. What does that mean to an organization like State Parks? What does that mean to a community and people and other stakeholders? We gotta figure that out, and we gotta write that book. And I'd like for us all to be a part of that. Figure out how to do this right. That we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. It'll never go away, right? Animosity doesn't ever sleep. Right? But at least we can create a situation or curate a situation where it happens in a more positive, linear way.
Right, and it's a journey, right?
Yeah,
We all
absolutely.
learn it.
Yeah.
We're not born with it.
No.
Or maybe most of us aren't, and maybe some of us who are. So I'm going to wrap up. So this is, and very short, maybe in one word or a few words. What is needed to work together successfully? And I'll just go, we'll start with John and we'll end with Christina on this one.
For me, just one word.
Respect. All right, good.
Trust.
Trust. Harry.
History.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of a cop-out, because I already said that. I might have one.
We may go around again. We got some time. Ron.
Dialogue, and another word that I think is really important that we think about when we talk about projects, sustainability.
Good. Christina.
Transparency.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Harry, did you have one more?
I don't know.
Okay.
If I do,
All right. Well, thank you very much. This is the time we're going to open it up for questions, but let's thank our panel for they're really good. Very good. I really like the way that you answered those questions, your thoughtful approach to them. So now's the time for you to ask questions, and I'm going to ask Wes to help us out with that. You want to use my mic? Okay, but tell people how to get to questions.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I can speak up. Okay, so there's lots of folks on Zoom, and I'm gonna be looking at what their questions are too. And the folks here, if you can scan your phone on the menu up on the walls, when you came in, put a question on the scan your phone on that, put your questions in that way.
Yeah, so we're just going to key up questions from this way so that we can just easily. Yeah. And the folks on the webinar as well have this. Okay. Once you get a question posed, I will read it. And if you want to ask it to a particular panelist, if you could just add that into your question as well. So. Okay, let me get it loaded up. I had to plug in my computer. Gonna have to reboot. Oh, there we go. Yeah. That's all right. Okay. So this is a question. So Harry said Via Ferrata is a new industry where logistics are still being developed. So why should Sinks Canyon's landscape be a test subject at this stage of the Via Ferrata industry for the sake of access? Does anybody want to answer that question? And you might want to reframe it in any way that you want to approach this, but basically is, is Sinks Canyon, will it be able to accommodate a Via Ferrata? I'll reframe it a little bit. Anybody want to answer that question?
I'll take a stab. I can't really answer
Yeah.
that question directly, but I can say that this process of determining whether a Via Ferrata is viable, makes sense is we're going to be having this conversation at many other potential sites in the future. The Via Ferrata, Kyle and I were talking about that. So this is sort of okay. Here's the issues that we're going to be encountering in the future. So we're learning on this.
Okay.
Well, I think, I guess a short answer to that would be, we don't know.
Uh-huh.
Right, I mean, we're still in the process of gathering the information to be able to say. What was that, really, figuring out what they mean. And so. Yeah, we don't have like a deadline.
Okay. This question is for Ron. So what sustainability practices, local or more broadly, do you think we need to adopt in the next 10 years in areas such as Lander?
Well, you know, talk history again, I guess. We in Wyoming, I think, had a really good, for a low population. But even in my lifetime, population of Wyoming is more than double. Of course, tourism is getting into a big business, it's bigger and bigger. And we kind of had in Wyoming, I think, a libertarian attitude, and because of our low population, we can do whatever we want, wherever we want, wherever we want. Can't do that. Do that. So I think we need to look at how, you know, the places like Park City, Moab, those places are looking at now. Oh, we ought to quit advertising because we're getting our country loved to death. It's kind of in that boat too. A lot of people in Lander think place is already being loved to death. We need to maybe back off a little bit. Now we have not really developed those areas that are so important.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Ron. So Christina, both you and Ron had alluded to potential other sites for this project. So this is a fairly technical question. I'm wondering where these potential sites are and what conversations have been had about changing the site. And I'll leave that up to Annie. So Kyle, I know you've been involved in those conversations. Ron, what are some other, what else has been discussed around Via Ferrata and other sites?
Well, unfortunately, I'll have to say that since Canyon Wild, we reached out to the primary Via Ferrata proponents to talk about these sorts of issues. And they refused to meet with us, so not much.
Okay, so
Well, there were,
yeah,
I'll just add a little bit. I mean, before that, there were 3 different meetings with stakeholders with were potential other locations. But at that time, again, there was the peregrine nesting issue with the original proposed location. So
Yeah.
there were 3 different small stakeholder meetings where new locations were discussed
all within the park.
within the park,
Yeah.
which is where this current proposed location came from.
Uh-huh.
That came out of the meeting. I've heard people say with forestry service land, they brought that up, which I wouldn't be in that conversation.
Yeah.
I'm not working for it. But those type of conversations could happen potentially. I just wouldn't be involved.
Okay,
They need to have.
all right. So having those conversations. So I want to ask, so this comes from the folks out in Zoom land. So several panelists have mentioned that they're not completely satisfied with the outcome of the Via Ferrata planning process. So do you see it as an example of successful community communication or collaboration? And you know, what maybe what have we learned from that? You know, if you don't think it is successful. So I'll open it up to anybody. Yeah, go ahead, Christina.
So it seems as though like the first choice was not viable because of the sporadic nesting grounds for the peregrine falcon. So they just went right across the street, and that area is not a great spot. We had, I think, a picture of it as we were discussing, and it's full sun throughout the summertime. If you're trying to hit tourist season, that's our peak tourist season time. So it's not a very comfortable place to climb because you get heat stroke pretty quick. The parking, I mentioned that is is pretty shallow. It's right at the mouth of the canyon, so visitors are coming in pretty fast. It's one of the loudest parts of the canyon because there's a boulder climbing wall that's right above it, so it reverberates a lot of the river noise off of the river from the Peregrine site back over to the Boulder Band site. So a lot of the noise pollution just reverberates right there. The rock structure isn't really that stable. I mean, it has a lot of springtime runoff. So if, you know, it's early springtime, you're gonna have water runoff, rock shifting. And then if they wanted to put it there because of, you know, trying to hit a later tourist season, I mean, there's not a lot of people that come through our town in late fall that are looking to get out and explore with families. Most of the families have gone back to school by Labor Day. So that time of the year of tourist season, it's not ideal. And it just feels like it was a far reach for a second option. The areas that I would say would be spectacular to have something are miles into the Wind River Range. I mean, it's a 9-mile or more hike through a treacherous path into the Circuit of Towers, which is a beautiful climbing spot that would have many beautiful vistas, Lizard Head, the whole Circuit of Towers. If you've ever been there, it's just breathtaking from the floor of it, let alone if you were able to get to the top of those peaks in there. So it just seems like where it is right now with a far reach for a second option.
Other thoughts on that? Ron, you have?
Yeah, what Christina said is very true. That rock heats up so hot in the summertime, basically going to be unusable. And that's what they have, that's the tourists come, and that's, I think, the people that are going to be using it. And also the climbers that climb on this cliff, it's actually, the cliff is named the Sandstone Bucket. But climbers call it, they have another name for it, they call it the Gunky Cliff. And the reason for that is the rock is so unstable, rock falls in that cliff all the time. So safety issues involved with that Ferrata and people that may be climbing underneath the Ferrata. It's going to be no safety issue. We actually have an avid climber, a guy that takes people up Gannett Peak and whatnot. He was climbing that cliff, been quite a few years ago now. But he fell on diet because of that very issue.
So I'm going to sort of shift the focus a little bit, and this is a question posed by the audience. So in Lander, what projects have been successful in building, you know, outdoor recreation and tourism in the community? And what were the values of these projects? I think that's an important question. And the locals' relationship to them. And yeah, so I'll stop there. So go ahead, Ron.
I'll leave that off. I think maybe we just need to look over the hill at Jackson Hole. There is a Ferrata, a really nice Ferrata, on Forest Service land, Jackson Hole. And again, that Ferrata was it has to comply with some federal environmental regulations. And also it's subject to a rigorous public comment. And the people of Jackson decided that that was acceptable. I think there are so many places around Lander on public lands. We could do the same thing.
Well, what about in Lander though? So, you know, has there been, and maybe Christina, you can talk about. So the question is, what projects have been successful in Lander? And why have they been successful? What were the values of those projects and how did they reflect the values of the people on Lander?
So one project that I saw developed around 2000, the timeframe of 2010 to 14 was the development of mountain biking in the area right behind the rocks, which is the BLM area. It was also up in the canyon. They took a trail that was up at the top of the switchbacks, an area called Fossil Hill, and you can take that back down a trail called Lower Brewers. And so the developers of that trail were following an original timber fall line. So they tried to keep with what had already been there as much as they could. And in JBR, I mean, I remember when I first moved there, I was going out there with with a high powered rifle and like sighting it in and shooting guns off. Now it's like, it's a high recreation area for non-motorized vehicles. So I think there were lots of conversations of working with different agencies and different recreators out there and making sure that everyone from leasing, leases that run their cows out in the forest land to the BLM land, that we were all acting as good neighbors and communicating like, hey, if you see cows out there, like give them the right of way, give them a wide berth, don't open our gates, and being respectful of the different people that were out there recreating. But if I could, and I don't want to seem long-winded, this came across my Instagram page. I follow a group called Native Women Ride. And I had shared this with some of the students in our luncheon today, but I want to just mention that we can't discuss outdoor recreation and parks and protected areas without discussing colonialism and genocide. We can't talk about wilderness, can't talk about recreation, conservation, invasive species, land, water, and plant animal management without discussing colonialism and genocide. And I think that that's part of the conversation that we also haven't really had that much input is from our Native community as how this canyon is important to their cultural aspect. And like how John said, that this canyon would help them survive and provided a lot of their sustenance of survival. So I don't feel like we can continue that conversation and continue developing bike trails, campsites, kayaking or water recreation up in that whole mountain area without bringing all of our community together, and especially our Native community.
And John, do you have anything to add to that? Okay, all right, thank you. So this is another question from the audience. It says, Sinks Canyon has been known as a place to rock climb. There are many routes currently set and many people that use these routes. So does the Via Ferrata change or alter this current use? What's your thinking on that?
I feel like climbing was a really good sport for many years in that area. And it was a place that you can go in the wintertime and get a suntan because it just gets so much heat out there.
Yeah.
And in the summertime, you can go to Wild Iris and there's a really good area of sport climbing. So there was a little bit of a trade-off between seasons. And it kind of feels like the need to develop this one buttress at the mouth of the canyon was a far reach to be like, well, let's take it to the next level. And it doesn't really come off that way, that it's a proper step in taking climbing and recreating to the next level.
So you do think it changes the I guess, the feel of the canyon in terms of its ability to accommodate rock climbing? And so within that context?
I think the people that are mostly coming into rock climb are seasoned rock climbers. And this, like Perry had told us earlier, is that it creates accessibility for families to climb together to reach heights that they haven't before. But it's just not a great spot to do that.
I see. So it does materially, it's materially different in terms of who uses it and the number of people possibly. I'm just sort of following up. I'm intuiting from this question. Like, what is the material difference of having a Via Ferrata there besides having a particular route that's actually pinned in? Will it bring in a different type of users, will it change the rock climbing culture in Sinks Canyon and in Lantern?
I think it will. So be it, but I think that I think you can evaluate the one touch. And that you want to add another piece of recreation to an existing really good climbing area. I think that question has to be asked, is it worth it? Not financially, is it worth it to the site?
Yeah.
Does it change the character of the site? Yeah.
So this is a follow-up question. It's actually related to this. So if the Via Ferrata project does move forward in Sinks Canyon at its proposed location, does Wyoming State Parks have plans for infrastructure development to accommodate higher tourism levels? Is that something that's part of that plan?
That's been part of the discussion, and of course, I mean, if it is something that happens, we have to continue that discussion. It's, as it is right now, you know, we're still in the phase of collecting information, so saying that we're gonna build a bathroom right now, would make it sense. I think within the future, that would necessarily, that could be part of that. We can discuss. That would be.
All right. So this one is somewhat related to the conversation, you know, about dialogue. And we've talked about communicating with the people in Lander. This question asks, do you consider feedback from people outside the local community? And if so, how do you engage in that? How do you balance that? And I guess, you know, from your perspective, from state parks, I mean, you listen to the people in Lander, but who else are you listening to?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is a state, it's called Sinks Canyon State Park.
Yeah.
So I mean, as a state agency, you have to consider everybody's voice in the state. When you look at the visitation of Sinks Canyon, it's not just people from Lander, it's people from all over Wyoming. It's people from all over the country, and people from all over the world, really. I mean, I've been working the visitor center there, and ran into people from Europe, from Asia, from Australia. I mean, people just come to the Sinks Canyon, whether it's on their way to Yellowstone or somewhere else, or specifically Lander, we do see that. So, you know, we do, and we invite, of course, anybody's voice to be part of that conversation. Most of the people that show up to that conversation are from Lander. I'll say that. But yeah, I mean, everybody's voice would be valid in that conversation.
So this next question is directed to John. And John, can you describe the sense of place, and that's in quotes, sense of place, and what that means, the sense of place in terms of Sinks Canyon and the Lander area, I guess, what it means for the Eastern Shoshone people?
What's there? You go back into the history of all of my people. We use that area during different times of the month when we're traveling through. Place where people work. Just the older Shoney's don't be called the sheep eaters. They left their mark there. Out of the canyon and the that's their story of the place. Among here on the native perspective side of the country. That's my role.
From the historical perspective. Okay. All right, next question. Kyle, do you think that more standard environmental and economic review and public engagement would have helped with the Via Ferrata project and future state park projects? So a more standard environmental and economic review. I'm not exactly sure how to. I'll take it, you take it from there.
I'm not sure how to answer that. A more standard economic review and
Environmental and economic review could have helped. Maybe put this within the context of the process that you went through and State Parks does.
that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, and then maybe think about, you know, would you tweak the process? I know you mentioned some, you know, we need to write the book.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I potentially. I mean, I guess the answer would be maybe. What it depends on the process they're talking about. I mean, if they're talking about like a federal NEPA process, maybe. I mean, I don't know. But I think we could do something different.
Yeah. And what specifically? I mean, you know, thinking back and about, you know, the whole process. And if you were to write the book, what would be, you know, something that you might change?
Again, I think the discussions in the public, I forget what I called that before, but the kind of the relationship building could have maybe happened earlier. you know, and maybe having these discussions specifically about the project before, you know, and outside of the context of the master plan might have helped that process. But I don't know. I think there are some folks who just don't like it. You know, they just definitely don't like it.
Yeah.
Then that started early.
Right.
It's not-
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to answer the question directly, I could, hey,
Go ahead, Christina, and then Ron.
So the conversation that I had with one of my regulars, they had mentioned like an environmental and financial review process and how like that would have been beneficial to see like if we build it, what does that budget look like? The budget to maintain it, budget to build it. But then what's going to be the financial, what's going to be the income that we see going into our community? Is it going to go directly to Lander? Is it going to go back to state parks? Who is going to financially benefit from this development? But then if you look at the macro level of it, doing that cost benefit analysis, is that going to change the fact that we are going to permanently change a structure that is a finite resource? And is that going to be beneficial to our community? No matter what the cost or whatever the benefit is going to be, taking that landscape and changing it would be worth it 20, 15, however many years down the road.
Okay. Ron.
Fortunately, the state of Wyoming currently doesn't have anything analogous to the nuclear license that go through on federal lands. Okay. There's just no process in Wyoming to do that. And one of those stakeholder meetings that we had a while back that Kyle mentioned, a couple of the Via Ferrata opponents stated that the reason they wanted to have the Via Ferrata in the state park because they didn't want to have to comply with federal, state, or federal environmental and safety regulations. I think that's a really poor reason to have a Via Ferrata in the state park.
Any comments on that?
well, I mean, I would just say we are going through a process
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah.
We're gathering information. I think it's important to remind folks too that this is not a project that's like definitely happening today. Or it's a project that we're investigating and gathering information on. So if the information comes back, you know, for example, we did cultural surveys. And if the cultural surveys would say that, you know, you can't do this, anything like this right here, then that would stop the process, stop the project. The same could be said for talk about engineers. Have an engineer look at it. If an engineer looks at it and says you can't do it here, might not happen there, right? So there is a process that we're following right now.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to change the focus a little bit. And I'm riffing off this question I'm reading that I'm seeing here. But, you know, the Via Ferrata has seemed to become a symbol for, you know, to stake a place on the ground. We either want this or we don't want this. But if we think about, you know, but we think about sort of this idea of recreational development overall occurring in Lander, you know, what is your perspective of, like, you know, is this a tipping point issue for you, for the town, for the community? It's like, this is the last straw. We can't, you know, this, you know, it's going to change us forever. Is that a fair way to start to think about this, as the Via Ferrata is just, it just happened to be the Via Ferrata, could have been something else. That was kind of what the question was. Would it have been something else that would have sort of got the community going, you know, what's going on? What's happening to our community? Is that a fair question?
I don't think it's the last straw by any means. I think it's the first straw. It's the first straw in developing Cinch Canyon State Park and commercializing Cinch Canyon State Park. And that's what citizens have tried to prevent ever since the 1880s.
Okay, so to you, it is what's in Sinks Canyon. It's not outside of that, it's not what's changing our community. Right. Is that fair? I mean, is that for you as well, Christina? It's a Sinks Canyon thing, not a community thing, in terms of the change that we're seeing?
I think it's a community
I
thing
mean,
because it starts with Think Canyon, but we've seen changes. Like I said, the bus slip is another high recreation, multi-use recreation with use for cows or for cattle grazing, as well as a few other sites that are BLM land. So the different agencies that we're surrounded by, land management agencies, as we see those develop and change, I think it's going to continue to unite. The community members on certain sides of a fence.
Yeah.
And just to lighten the mood a little bit, when you asked the question, I was actually thinking, man, the one thing that has broken Landers back is when you say we can't have 4th of July fireworks because you can't shoot off your damn fireworks and there's no 4th of July. So I think just as we see other recreational sites develop, there's going to be good conversations that will unite people on different sides of the fence.
All right. Yeah. I'm going to read a question here. This may seem a little bit sort of outside, but it's kind of interesting. So snowboarding was once outlawed by the skiing community because it was different, unsafe. It has proven itself to be an incredible activity, bringing untold numbers of our youth outside, improving the quality of their lives. In Ouray, Colorado, we found the same with our youth and the 3 via ferratas that have been installed and embraced by the community. Is there any reason this would be any different in Lander? That makes sense.
So
I think so.
in 2008, I was one of 3 people that developed a community garden. And at the time, Carl Sutton was the person who was able to get the property of this land that had previously just been a dumping ground for snow. And he had this idea to start a community garden. So me, Carl, and this other gentleman, Andy, we went in and we put garden beds into the ground. And many of the neighbors came out to a city council meeting, and their complaint was you didn't come and talk to us. And so that was something that we heard as a small board and said, okay, yeah, we're trying to ask for forgiveness instead of asking for permission. And I think with this, yes, via Ferrata could be accepted in the community, but it's a retroactive thing at this point where you went ahead and wanted to develop it. You had a plan, you were getting ready to get the engineer out there, and then we find out about it. And then that's where there's the reaction instead of a response from the community that's opposed to it. So I think that there is a possibility for it to be developed, but I'm going to say again, like it is just not a great spot for it to be developed. And it would have been great to have more stakeholders invited to the table that are not just the developers, not just the grandchildren.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that? If you want to queue, you can also queue anything up over there for me, but this is again somewhat of a technical question around approval processes, but what does the approval process look like for the development and sinks, specifically climbing routes, right? So has state parks, do you approve climbing routes in Sinks Canyon, and how might decisions there relate to the Via Ferrata?
Well, the routes that exist right now, as far as I know, we're pioneered in. People came in there many years ago, some cases before it was a state park, and we're quite right in there. And there haven't been any that I'm aware of that went in. Surely while I've been there, that was probably asked to put in that you had a say in it. And I don't know of anything going in the last few years. If one was to go in, they would certainly need approval to do that. If you don't have like a proper management plan, but it is something that would discuss. If that
I think it does. We're conferring about how to end, what question to end on. And we've got one here that's probably not a good question to end on, so I'm looking for another one, but this is kind of intriguing. So I'm hoping someone in the panel can speak as to the role of misinformation in the process such as this. So as an example, specific to the Via Ferrata and Lander, I've heard multiple community members confidently express that they knew that users either did or did not have to use the Via Ferrata with a professional guide service. So, indicating that, there might have been some misinformation. He or she says, I'm not looking for an answer to this question, however, but I think the confidence with which community members express opposing understandings or express their views either for or against, is telling when it comes to the amount of misinformation that's spread through the community around issues like this, right? So this really revolves around, when these things heat up, we see a lot of, there's a lot of information that's floating around. Some of it's not right. And then, how does that exacerbate, the issue? Was that a problem, from maybe your perspective on this issue, misinformation coming to fore? And can you provide any examples and sort of like anything that strikes a nerve for you?
Boy, that's been a serious issue, I think, from the beginning of the Ferrata project. Most people, when we started the Ferrata issue 2 years ago, I proposed what we call the paragraph clips. I would venture to say that most people in Lander, including myself, didn't have a clue what Via Ferrata even was. And that just shows how lax this communication project was. Even recently, there's been newspaper articles in the local paper that were just completely erroneous, and still published news items. So it's still going on, and it sure would be great if we change that.
Figure a way to get past that and to identify what is misinformation. Christina, do you have anything to add on to that? And Kyle or John?
I'm a huge proponent of finding out what your news source is, doing your research, and there is a lot of hubbub that goes around. Like, I originally had heard that it was part of the Sinks Canyon Ranch development that was supposed to be like for the affluent to be able to come and stay at a resort ranch that's just outside the mouth of the canyon, and that developer and the Via Ferrata developer were in cahoots, and so.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's what I had heard, but then when I started doing more research and talking to more people about it, it was like, oh, well, let's understand more of the facts about it instead of just what we're hearing.
And Kyle, how have you dealt with misinformation on this?
Well, it depends on the level of misinformation, I guess, because I've heard it all too. Right?
Yeah.
Personal things about me to things about the Ferrata or the process that went through. It happens on Facebook, it happens in news articles, like recently said. So we try to correct it when we can. We put things out on our official channels when we do something that's false, like our website, for instance, Canyon State Park, or Facebook, or Instagram. We have a Twitter. We don't have a Twitter, but we have some official channels. And yeah, we try to combat it that way. And sometimes when people say things to us in the community that we know are not true, we say, well, actually, it's happening right now, or what happened in the past. So yeah, I mean, we address it as we can. There's a lot of it that happens that we don't even hear or know about. So some of it, again, you mentioned it happens in a lot of other cases all over the place. And so this is just one example, and I think sometimes it's a level of confirmation bias, right? People want the information that tells you you're correct.
Yeah.
And so a lot of this stuff goes out of the window, whether it's true or not. And this is like a small example, or smaller example of the macro.
Yeah. makes it really difficult for, to get down to the heart of the issues and to begin to understand them if this is continuing to fly around. Yeah. So I'm going to end on a different note. This will be the last question. I want you each to address this. And I'm going to start with, John, your word was respect, right? And so this question is related to that. So is there a way that the community and all its different interest groups, sectors, however you want to think about it, all the different parties who are engaged in this, and even outside of that, is there a way to begin to connect community members? So that, when issues like this arise, the community has a capacity to work through it and deal with it in a positive way. What does that look like? John, I'm going to start with you. Is there a way? What do you think about that?
Building a relationship with all people. Being something we can all agree on. And it's coming down to that word respect and communication.
Yeah.
That's what you're going to start. Very bottom of it.
And it's the one-to-one.
Right.
Yeah.
Comes from here too.
Yep. Kyle. So, how do you vision? What is the way? You said we need to write the book. What would be the first chapter for you?
And I think again, it goes back to the relationships that we have with our users.
Yeah.
Whether that's the people in the community, the immediate communities, or user base, whether it's like a climate community or community, whatever that may be. I mean, us having those strong relationships where we can have these discussions and trust each other, and build that, build that we're getting is connected. Honestly,
Uh-huh.
I think it has to start.
Uh-huh. Relationship. Harry, what does that mean to you?
I think there needs to be a willingness to let go. Don't push water up a street.
Yeah.
If it just doesn't feel right, whether or not that's the pressure, the input from the local community. There's always another avenue, as Stephen mentioned, there's another place, maybe way away. And I think all parties need to have a willingness to go, you know what? I feel this way, but I have to let go because it doesn't make sense. Either they make sense on the other side, they gotta be willing to respect that other side, or they gotta be willing to say, not the right time, not the right place. So we need to do that.
All right. And for you, Ron?
I agree with what my colleagues said, sure. In addition to that, I think it would be very helpful. We in the community, state, had a framework that we knew what the process was. We had some steps that we know these are the steps we're going to go through in order to make a decision. I think that would be very helpful, and currently, the state does not have to.
So a clear framework. And Christina, your word was transparency. So I don't know, I may have just put that back in your mouth and you didn't want to say it, but so from you going forward in terms of building community around this, what would it take?
I think John had made a good point at the beginning that it could be left to a vote. I think I found out about it kind of late. I found out about it after Canyon Wild had developed, and I started seeing green and white signs around the community and started asking questions about it. But I think, having just gone through an election cycle, there's lots of, there could have been a time that we could have put it to a vote, because if you live under a rock like I do, then it was hard to hear about hate hearings and stay on top of it on social media. But it would have been nice to see it as a vote because we are as taxpayers, like community as recreators in that canyon. It would have been nice to see and have our voice heard and not just not have that decision left to a certain field.
All right, well, thank you. All right, let's thank our panelists again. Do you want to say anything? Here.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
All right, thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Boy. Sure is interesting.
Yes, it is.
Contact information. If you have any contacts, please. Okay.
I think I have it on here.
Yeah, because I've got my work phone. And that's the number for it here.
I mean, the impact on there. People like spread out without really doing whatever.